Hello everybody and welcome to NQA's webinar on the migration of OHSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. My name's Terry Fisher, I'm the Principal Assessor here at NQA. So firstly, as we go throughout the webinar, if you've got any questions you can type them into the chat box, etc. For all of you that are registered to be part of this webinar, you'll also receive the presentation. It's also being recorded, so you can play it back at your convenience should you wish to share it with colleagues, etc., or listen to it at a more convenient time. So if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to type them in. Just a reminder, we're not allowed to consult, so I can't give individual answers to questions specific to a particular organisation, but I can clarify what the standard is looking for and help clarify any misunderstandings of interpretation to the standard. But we are not consultants, we're assessors, and you have to understand there are limits to what we can answer during the webinar. So, just remind everybody that NQA has a global presence. We can cover international certification globally. We have various offices and work with various associated offices throughout the world. So penetration globally is not a problem. We can cover all geographical locations or the majority of geographical locations. NQA as an organisation has been established for over 30 years and we currently have over 43,000 certificates globally. We take the approach that we need to work with our clients, not just issue certificates, etc. We want to build a meaningful relationship where we can support our clients to ensure that you get effective implementation of the management systems and the various services that we offer, including training. There's a couple of NQA's price promise issues there that you can read through. In the UK, we don't charge additional travel expenses, etc. It's all inclusive in our fees, which are all transparent. As I said at the start, I've just got a question here. Somebody said they can't. Hopefully that's resolved that problem. First question here is, we've received a question in, what are the changes from 18,001? That'll become apparent as I go throughout the webinar, but if you've got any specific questions, I'll try to answer those as we go through. So as I've said, all copies of the slides and the recordings will be issued via our website, and individual registrations will receive the presentation of all the slides. If you've got any questions as we go, use the chat box at any time. Although we will have a question and answer session at the end, by all means ask questions as we go. What I'll try to do, if there are any common themes within those questions as we're going, I'll try and answer them as we go through. So don't hesitate to type your questions in the box. So firstly, why implement ISO 45001? The main priority there is to enhance and improve occupational health and safety performance, delivering a positive culture change based on risk-based thinking, worker engagement. It should deliver a systematic approach to help reduce culpability and primarily to protect the working group. It's a proven commitment from leadership. It can help coordinate action and should deliver improvement over time. The ISO standard itself, ISO 45001, uses a common structure of management systems referred to as Annex SL. The elements that are particularly that we're looking at from an audit point of view are sections 4 to 10. The first 3 sections are quite useful to know, but the scope, as termed in the standard, is referring to what the standard itself is trying to deliver. The normative references, if applicable, are referenced there. One interesting element there in section 3, terms and definitions. It can be quite useful to familiarise yourself with the terms and definitions within the standard, because this can help understanding, and it can also help clarity as we're going through the audit process. So it can be very useful to look at section 3. But the actual bits as part of the assessment, the elements that we'll actually audit against, are sections 4 to 10 inclusively. And for those of you with other management standards existing, sort of 9001, 2015, 14001, 2015, etc., you should be familiar with this framework. This Annex SL framework is now commonly applied to all revised or new management standards. So it helps integrate the standards where they get applied within a single organisation. It really does help bring the business management system or the organisation's management system together as a cohesive activity. So the culture, when we talk about culture, we want to enhance culture and change culture for the better. So we're looking at improvement and improve both culture and performance over time. That's ultimately what the management system, an effective management system, is trying to deliver. The context of the organisation. This is a new element that's been brought in via the adoption of Annex SL. This is very different from 18001. This element wasn't technically an element within the management standard of 18001. So the context, understanding the internal and external issues an organisation faces, what drives and pushes an organisation to make changes, to do various things. All these things, whether they be commercial changes or changes in product or service or changes in working patterns, changes in processes or enhancing plant and equipment within processes, all these things are done for a reason, and they all can have an influence and impact on the overall performance of the occupational health and safety management system. So this is a new requirement, very different from 18001, and this is looking at the context of the organisation, what the organisation does, and the various elements, as I say, that push and pull the organisation into various directions and decision-making processes. Also in this new section of context, it talks about interested parties. In 45001, the primary interested party are workers, and we use the term workers deliberately as opposed to employees, because we're talking about all workers that are influenced and can be influenced by the organisation's needs and requirements. A lot of organisations may not have a high number of employees, but they may have a high number of subcontracted workers, etc. So we've also got to, so we use the term workers as an all-inclusive phrase throughout the standard. The workers are the core interested party when it comes to occupational health and safety, and that includes workers at all levels within the organisation. So whether they be directors, managers, operators, engineers, technicians, etc., all levels are included in the phrase worker. Interested parties can also include legal enforcement agencies, regulatory requirements, and commercial considerations. All these things need to be considered as part of the business management system, and as they can influence the OHS management system effectiveness overall. The strategy and leadership in section 5 of Annex SL is looking at the strategy of the organisation, its policy, its roles, its existing culture, what it needs to do, why does it need to do that, what's driving it, what's taking it forward. How are you going to plan to achieve your strategy, what changes, what improvements are going to be made, etc. And the assessment of those changes prior to implementing them in terms of how that can impact on the organisation's OHS performance. It talks about roles and responsibilities, which is a key element, and this involves all levels. Responsibilities of different levels within the organisation, but everybody has a role to play within an effective OHS management system. Hence the inclusion of the phrase participation. Workers of all levels need to be involved in both the development and implementation of the management system. And this is a really strong element of ISO 45001. This worker engagement and participation is a really critical factor in all OHS systems. And I think the terminology used in 45001 builds on the strengths that was already identified in 18,000. So primarily, there's nothing really new in that leadership section, but the element and the requirements have been enhanced throughout. Can someone just confirm whether they can still hear me? We may have an issue with the sound. Brilliant, thank you. I've got a couple of confirmations there. It's just that somebody left because they couldn't hear anything. So thank you for confirming that. That's great. So that's an overview of the leadership section in section 5. Section 6 of the new management system structure, Annex SL, looks at planning. So we're looking at hazard identification, risk and opportunity, compliance obligations, and OHS objectives. So I'll go through each one of these in detail as we go through the presentation, but hazard identification, so it's the formal risk assessment that we'll all be familiar with in OHS practice. Risks and opportunities, so that isn't just as a result of the hazard assessment or the various things. It can also be strategic risk and opportunities. The business is planning to make some changes or planning to enhance a particular process or make some changes in working patterns, etc. So it's looking at those risks and opportunities that an organisation faces and how that's implemented as part of an OHS management system. Compliance obligations, the terminology is interchangeable between legal and other requirements or compliance obligations. As an assessment body, we won't get hung up on the phraseology there. It's looking at what do you need to do, why do you need to do it, and it can be interesting to link that back to the interested parties and the various things. So compliance obligations are not all statutory or mandatory. There could be organisational requirements that you have to do things in a particular way. There could be local agreements with worker groups, etc., that things have to be done in a particular way. So these compliance obligations need to be identified, controlled, and delivered. OHS objectives, again, that's nothing new within management systems, certainly 18,001, but it has been enhanced in 45,001 in relation to it's not just having the objectives, but it's also the plans of how those objectives are going to be delivered with timescales, making them smart, measurable, etc., time framed and realistic. So it's actually looking at how you're actually going to deliver those objectives, not just about creating some objectives for the sake of objectives. And it's also worth considering that your OHS objectives should be linked to your hazard identification and your risks and opportunities that the organisation faces. So there should be a link there between at least some of the requirements there in terms of hazard identification and the strategic risks and opportunities that an organisation was considering. In section 7 of Annex SL, we look at resources and competence, awareness, communication, and documented information. Got a question here regarding context. Where does context align with Plan, Do, Check, Act scenario? The whole of the management system is based around the Plan, Do, Check, Act framework, and the context is understanding what needs to be done and who's interested in having that done and why are they interested in that. If you don't understand why something needs to be delivered, then it can be very difficult to deliver it effectively. So the context of the organisation is looking at that plan of why do we need to do that? What do we need to do it for? Who do we need to do it for? And importantly, how do we know if we've achieved that? So looking at how that context and that need can be measured and confirmed as part of the activity within the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. Hope that answers that question. As I say, section 7 and section 8 looks at supporting operations, looks at so competence is a key element here. So it could also, that can also link to statutory requirements, certainly here within the UK, for example. In terms of, I'll use the example of gas safe within the UK. So there's a legal requirement for people to be technically competent to perform a particular function. And you've got to define those competencies for job roles and responsibilities so that you can deliver that need on an ongoing basis. If you don't know how somebody's going to be competent to perform a task or what's needed to be competent to perform a task, then how can they be expected or developed into delivering that task or delivering that responsibility going forward? So there needs to be a development plan if they're not already competent, etc., etc. So there's a strong link there in competence and roles and responsibilities and communication. So people need to be aware what their responsibilities are, what the expectation is of them, what how they can influence and what their responsibilities are in terms of eliminating risk and preventing hazards, etc., and protecting both themselves and other workers as part of the activity. The communication element applies both internally and externally. How do you communicate all these various things that go on within an organisation? That must be defined, it must be controlled, and you must also verify that what you've tried to communicate has been effectively delivered appropriately, whether that be internally or externally, and there needs to be ways of measuring that and monitoring that. Documented information is a change in terminology in terms of records and documents, etc. Documented information does include all forms of media, so it can be written, in a process activity. The process may be controlled by programs and software. So controlling the version of the program or the software that controls the process, or as an element of control over the process that can impact on people's interaction with that particular activity, it's important then to control that as documented information so that randomly changes or whatever don't just randomly take place within a controlled process if it's software driven. There's a whole range of information, and documented information now is an all-encompassing term that's used within management standards, and it isn't necessarily something that's specifically got a 45001 label on it. Documented information could be, as I say, data that's already recorded within the management system within your organization. It's what you normally do on a day-to-day basis. Is all included within the documentation documented information phrase within the management standard. So it doesn't have to specifically have a health and safety label or title on it to be relevant to the management system. Within Section 8, we're looking at the management of change. We're looking at the hierarchy of control in terms of preventing occupational ill health and injury. Looking at management of change in terms of plan the change and assess the change prior to implementation. Communicate that change, engage with people to make the change effective, know what you're trying to deliver, why the change is being implemented. Good participation of workers at all levels within that change process. People are more likely for that change to be effective, are more likely to be in better engagement with the workers, is more effective delivery of change rather than just it's something that's done without their involvement. So it's important communication and participation is considered when you're looking at management of change. The management standard using Annex SL also looks at procurement, which is a key control mechanism and a key element that can link to competence, it can look to contractor control, it can look to all types of operational control. And we're also in Section 8 looking at, as well as operational controls, we're looking at emergency preparedness. Then in Section 9 and 10 of the standard, we're looking at performance evaluation, including internal audit, management review, corrective actions, the improvement processes, and also the compliance of evaluation of compliance within that element of the management standard. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of the various elements from 4 to 10 inclusive, and that's how management systems or ISO management systems are structured since 2015. So hence the change to 9014, hence the introduction of 45001 using the same framework within the management system. So the starting point, you need to look at the scope of the management system as it applies to your organization. And only when you've understood what the leadership is trying to do, the strategic direction of the organization, its activities, the workers and the interested parties, and what the organization is trying to achieve overall, can you then define the scope? This is all in Section 4 of the standard. The context of the organisation can obviously vary, both in terms of size and scale of an organisation, but different types of organisation. If you think for a minute, there's a few examples there. Water company is a public limited company, has probably a very different context to a university, which is obviously an educational establishment, which would have a very different context again to a food manufacturer, maybe a private limited company, or a family-owned engineering business, which may be a smaller enterprise with different needs and requirements. All these organisations are very different. They have varying external and internal issues that they need to address, and its relationship and communication with its interested parties can be very different depending on the type of the organisation. So the management standard is looking at the effectiveness of that communication and that understanding of why do you do things in a particular way, etc., not just the, oh, well, that's the risk, that's the hazard. It's looking at a broader, and it was always implied in 18,001 was the context of the organisation and the culture. It's now been firmed up within the actual structure of the management system within the context of the organisation. So there's a quick breakdown of clause 4, the context of the organisation, the understanding the organisation and its context, what does it do, why does it do it, understanding the needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties. So other interested parties could be owners of the business, neighbours of the business, customers and clients of the business, etc. And only when you've considered those and you've got an understanding of those can you then determine the scope of the management system. The scope needs to be available as documented information somewhere within the management system. And there's some general requirements in 4.4 about what the management system has to contain and what it's trying to deliver. When looking at the context, there are various models that we can use to try and identify external factors. There could be a Pestel analysis, or there could be internal factors, and you can use various models there. The standard doesn't prescribe which model or which way you go about this, how you do it, why you do it, but you must be able to demonstrate as part of the assessment process that you've considered external and internal factors and how those influence you and what those controls and influences are, and how you then deliver and meet those needs and requirements of interested parties going forward. That's why it's a foundation of the management standard, is to look at the context of the organisation. Workers and interested parties. You can see I've tried to demonstrate there some commonalities between some widely adopted management standards, i.e. 9001 and 14001, so customers, community, suppliers, regulators, etc. In the management system and understanding that about a particular organisation, the context is a central core that can influence all those elements. And because workers are the primary interested group in terms of 45,001, we include all types of workers at all levels from that, whether they be a director of the business that may also be a stakeholder in the business, maybe a part owner or a full owner, etc. But it also includes managers, contractors, agency staff, in terms of they are regarded as workers. Interested parties could also include regulators, customers, and obviously to some extent it may involve visitors and members of the public depending on your activity and the operations of your actual organisation. These are all things that need to be considered. Because the various standards or the management system standards are now using this common framework, we should be looking at ISO management systems as business management systems, although they have particular discipline requirements for health and safety, for example, and different ones slightly for environmental, and different ones again for quality management, the basic structure of the management system remains quite stable in terms of Annex SL, and there should be some commonality in terms of application of that throughout an organisation. Somebody's asked a question about the presentation. I'm not sure what the format of the presentation, when you receive the presentation, whether it comes out as a PowerPoint presentation or a PDF copy. I'm not sure, but I know you definitely received some form of presentation there. The question was, do we get it in as PowerPoint or PDF? I'm not sure, but I can confirm that later. So going on from workers and interested parties. The scope of the management system, as I say, once you've looked at the context and you understand the worker groups and the interested parties, you can then define the scope of the management system. The emphasis in 45001 is also on leadership. The term management has been dropped because leadership is more than just a management system. Leadership is an all-inclusive term. There's been a lot of changes here in terms of interpretation there. We want the whole of the organisation to be engaged with the OHS system, and the leadership at various levels from the top down needs to be engaged within that process. So it's an all-inclusive term, so from the more senior person on site to all the various different roles and staff that are involved on the site and different worker groups, etc. Everybody needs to be engaged, and leadership needs to encourage that engagement and take responsibility for that. Also needs commitment, and traditionally, as ever, that can be demonstrated and is a requirement of there needs to be a documented OHS policy, whether that be a standalone policy for OHS or integrated within a combined policy. That's down to the organisation, but it has the various criteria within the standard to meet. The system requires and is intended to provide commitment to safety and health of conditions to prevention of worker-related injury and ill health. We talk about ill health now, not just accidents, and this is enhanced within this 45001. It's always been an element there, but again, it's been enhanced in this management standard to consider not just the accident stats and the various things, but looking at the overall well-being of workers and employee groups. Within the leadership clauses, there are organisational roles and responsibilities. The phrase accountabilities have been dropped from the title. Roles and responsibilities need to be available as documented information in some format. So people need to have documented information to understand where they fit within the organisation and also what their roles and responsibilities are within that particular role that they perform or are expected to perform. Consultation and participation with workers is a key element of this management standard, and as part of the leadership requirements, it's talking about mechanisms for and removal of barriers. So it's about delivering a positive OHS culture within an organisation. It's no good saying we're really committed to OHS, oh, but we haven't got time to do that, we're not doing that, we're not doing this, etc. So it needs to be a consistent commitment and demonstrated commitment, both in terms of time and resources, information, communication, development and training. non-manager participation to identify hazards and controls, and other, including that participation in all other elements of the management system, including the policy. So, you know, it's good to have that worker engagement and that participation at all levels within the management system. When we're looking at planning, and this touches on both planning and operational control, you should always apply the hierarchy of control. So elimination of a particular risk or hazard in terms of OHS is the most effective method. Going down through substitution, engineering controls, administrative and PPE. It's very important that we understand that the administrative and PPE controls are less effective. And so the first three elements of the hierarchy of control should be applied in preference to the last two. Just giving someone a written instruction and giving them some PPE is some of the least effective methods of controlling risk and exposure of workers to risk and hazards. So you do need to consider that when you're looking at the various operational controls that are being applied. And that's one of the reasons why, obviously, this links back to hazard identification and assessment, because if you've got opportunities to eliminate the risk, etc., it's far better than trying to control it. If you can take away that risk in its entirety by changing a method, etc., then that's preferred. But you've also got to consider, is the change you're making, does that bring about any new risks or opportunities that you hadn't previously considered because you're now planning to modify a process or modify an activity in relation to a risk. So a quick look at the questions, make sure I aren't missing anybody out. No, there's no new questions. So that's the application of the hierarchy of control within hazard and risk identification and planning. We also talk about opportunities, because there'll be opportunity to meet legal and compliance obligations whilst engaging with workers. There could be opportunities to change the way we do things. There's a lot of flexibility within the management system. It isn't about having things in tablet of stone, although you do need to understand that you need safe systems of work and methods, etc., and need consistent. But that's not to say if technology changes or you're looking at a different thing, you can't change anything. It's not about being fixed on one thing forever. It's about moving forward, continual improvement over time. The planning clause looks at actions to address risks and opportunities, hazard identification and assessment of risks and opportunities shall be maintained as documented information. So there needs to be some documented information, whether that be electronic or whether it be hard copy form or whatever. We need to see some evidence of that. The method and there's numerous methods to use for hazard identification and risk assessment. It's down to the organisation to define an effective method that's appropriate for it. The standard doesn't pre-describe which method has to be adopted. There needs to be determination of legal and other requirements that are applicable to the organisation and its activities. There needs to be planning to take action. So based on, some of the hazards and risks identified as part of the risk assessment activity, you may be developing OHS objectives and plans to achieve those objectives over time. There again, those objectives need to be smart and they need to be relevant to the identified hazards and risks and opportunities that an organisation may face. The planning to achieve those objectives also needs to be documented. So it's not just having the objectives, it's also, well, how you're going to get from A to B, how you're going to implement your objective, what's the time scale, who's going to be involved, who's going to be responsible for that element, etc., etc. So as you can see, as part of the plan, do, check, act model, risk assessment is one of the central core activities, and it's a primary driving force behind significant elements of the management system. The support section is centered on communication, and leaders of the organisation need to be able to effectively deliver resources and information necessary for the establishment, maintenance and control of the improvement of the management system throughout. So leadership is a key function at all levels within an organisation. So that may be appropriate for team leaders have a leadership role, supervision may have a different role, senior managers have a different role, etc. So it all depends on your own organisation and the structure and the resources applied, but the support functions are key for an effective delivery of the management system overall. So people need resources, so they need equipment, whatever it be, appropriate to the activities, they need information, they may need some training. All that is to help deliver effective support of the operational controls within the organisation. So as we go, have a quick run through the section 7, resources. Obviously, that depends on the organisation and the activities that it undertakes. Competence also applies to external workers and contractors. So it also links to procurement. So obviously, you need to understand if you're procuring a service from an external agency, for example, you need to understand what you want from them. Is there any technical competences that they need to have? Is there information relating to your particular activity that they need to be aware of as they come onto your premises to undertake this activity? And how has all that come together as part of a management system? Awareness of workers, including the ability to remove themselves from work situations which present an imminent and serious threat to life or the health and protection of them. If they need to do that, they shouldn't be adversely affected for doing it. So if somebody says, we stop the job because, and as long as that's a reasonable and activity and they've done it for the right reasons, they shouldn't then be punished afterwards. So this again is coming back both to the leadership and the culture of an organisation. People should be encouraged to participate and voice their concerns and help to identify improvement activities to reduce any risks and opportunities. So it's a whole process that the organisation should be involved at all levels as part of the management activity. Communication has been expanded and enhanced to include external and internal communications, and there needs to be documented information in relation to what that communication is, how it's controlled, who reports what to who, etc. So how that's all comes together can be done in numerous ways, but there needs to be supporting information and documented information there to show how that's being delivered, both internally and externally for interested parties. As I said earlier, documented information can be on a range of media, so it's not just hard copy paper based. It's information, it must be suitably controlled. We talked briefly before about software programs that control the process. So controlling that software program is as important as controlling the documented procedure for a particular work activity, because it's the software that's actually controlling the process and the controls, or some element of the process and its controls. So therefore, that needs to be suitably controlled and protected, so it doesn't get corrupted, or it doesn't just get upgraded, because the upgrade could actually change the operational control applicable to the particular scenario, etc. So it's worth thinking about documented information. It's an all-inclusive term, and like I've said, it doesn't have to have an OHS title or whatever. It can be that's just the way we do it. We collate that data there, we've got that information there. So all elements of an organization's function can be included in documented information. Operational control. This, at the end of the day, is the central hub of what we're trying to do, is deliver effective, safe operational control to prevent injury and ill health to workers. This is the bottom line. This is what we really need to deliver and focus on. Obviously, that involves operational planning and control, so the general including documented information and adapting work to workers, etc., etc. This is important because going back to both physical and mental well-being, it's something to consider about how the work actually works, not just the theoretical, I think it works in this way. This is actually taking the real life scenario and your experience and knowledge of your own organizations and using that to effectively deliver an improvement over time for the workers. Eliminating hazards and reducing OHS risk. There again, key elements. And this is what operational control is trying to deliver. The management of change, so it's not just, oh, we're going to make that change because we need to get more widgets out, or we need to get more throughput, or whatever. It's how we're going to manage this change. What do we need to do? How do we need to talk to various worker groups? Who needs to be involved? Is there any risk that we can foresee? Is there any opportunities for improvement? You know, consolidation of processes, etc. Whatever that may be, it needs to be considered. And procurement within this section of Section 8 of the standard also includes general procurement, contractors, and outsourcing requirements within the standard. A quick question on scope. Is the scope of the management system and the certification scope issued by NQA the same thing, is the question. In answer to that, no, it isn't necessarily. The scope of certification is a statement that goes on your certificate, which gives somebody an overview of what your organization is and what it does. Your scope of your management system can be different. It may be a paragraph to explain what's applied at different sites, different operations, etc., etc., etc. So it can be very different, and they both need to be documented ideally. Your scope of your registration is documented on your certificate, and your scope of your management system is a requirement to be documented so that people can read it and understand it. The next question, can ISO 45001 be used by organizations that don't want to go for certification? By all means, the management system applies whether you go for registration or not. I would turn around and say from you know, I know I'm biased, but obviously one of the benefits of having certification is that you're making a public declaration to the various internal and external interested parties that not only are you committed to delivering these, but it's also been externally registered and verified by an external approved organisation. So there can be advantages of having the registration. Lots of questions here. There's a question of do we have a list of major changes from 18,001 to 45? Yes, we do. That's available via our website, so you can go onto NQA website and look. There's a list of changes and a brief description of how those changes are implemented and interpreted from the various two standards. That's a documented thing that anybody can download from our website. Next question that we've got is about integration. How do we integrate the new documented ISO 45001 to existing 9001 2015? Well, there are some common elements. Context may be similar, but you probably have to revise slightly, interested parties, etc. But because of the Annex SL framework, there should be quite a bit of similar structure that you can use for both applications. A corrective action, for example, in principle, is primarily the same management system approach to corrective action across all the disciplines. Yes, within OHS you need to do investigations and root cause and various things, but that would also be useful and effective within quality management systems. So it's just understanding the appropriate approach for each discipline. But yes, there are a lot of commonalities across the management structure. In terms of corrective action, can you use corrective action processes if tasks? Well, any corrective action, the key phrase in the corrective action is action. The question is, can you use corrective action processes if task slip and operational control is seen to be less effective than it should be? I would say yes. You just go around and did it deliver the benefit? Is it delivering the benefit? If it isn't, have a look at it again, reuse the same cycle, keep going around that loop. It's about delivering effectiveness and delivering benefit of what's required. Sometimes we think we're going to do something or implement something, it doesn't deliver what we wanted it to do, so there we have to go back and look at it again. Some things cause more, we plan on implementing something and it actually causes more issues trying to implement it than the benefit it was trying to resolve. So we relook at it. That's the nature of management systems. It's real world application. Have a look at it and look at it in a corrective action point of view. Key phrase there is action. You need to do something else. You need to do something different. The process remains in principle the same. You just may have to reapply it. Think of it a different way. Question here about clause 8.2, emergency preparedness. Would 8.2 apply to suppliers? It depends what they're supplying and how that fits into your requirements of your organisation and the OHS considerations for that. So emergency preparedness may be applicable to suppliers, but it's for you to define that appropriately for your performance and how it would impact on your operations and the worker groups connected with your operations. Next question, does the boundary of the scope need to specify boundaries? If so, are these boundaries the company or boundary? You need to define that. The application of the scope needs to define the boundaries of application within your organisation. It's about how you're going to apply it within your organisation and the impacts it has on the various interested parties. That's what we're trying to look for, an understanding of that. It's not a 15-page whatever. It's a summary. It just gives someone an overview of how you're applying that, and whether it defines your own group's organisation or whether it looks at markets or whatever, depends on your activities and the different things. question here about training. Is it required for someone with a lead auditor qualification at 18,001 to do another course for 45,001 or just a refresher? I would recommend someone do a refresher for an 18,001 lead auditor course. Obviously, NQA provide refresher training. There's various levels. You can get information from our website on training. It's not specified within the standard, but it's a good idea. This 45,001 is a very different standard in structure and requirement to 18,001. So I would definitely say it's worthwhile looking at refresher training for lead auditors in that scenario. Again, another question on scope, how to determine the boundaries when establishing the scope. Well, you need to define that depending on how you're going to apply the management system within your organisation. That's what the standard is looking to be clear on from an assessment point of view. So that's a quick roundup of all the questions to date. We'll get back into operational control. So looking at operational control, like I say, this really is the core of what the management system is trying to achieve. This is the actual day-to-day protection and prevention of ill health for worker groups. So all assessments have got to comprehensively look at the operational controls and the effective delivery of those controls in relation to that. And obviously the standard gives you some things to consider there, including emergency preparedness. All these things may well be already established within your organisation. In a lot of organisations, it's already a mandatory requirement to do some emergency preparedness for this and for that, and there's legislation certainly within the UK for fire and training and various things. So look at what you've already got, look at your operating controls, look at your performance historically, and the direction of travel for your organisation, what it plans to do in the future. But Section 8 is really the foundation of what an effective management system is trying to deliver. It's effective operational control in the real world, not just a theoretical, I've got some documents, I've got some safe systems of work, etc. It's how does that translate into the actual operations? And that's the key effectiveness of assessment for the management system. Quickly going on to Section 9. Having carried out the activities in Clause 8, it's time to monitor, measure, analyse and look at performance. Evaluation of compliance is also a key element here, looking at those compliance obligations that you identified earlier within the management standard. Then you've also got to say, are you now delivering those compliance obligations? How do you know that? How frequently are you going to check? How do you know it's been effective? So having a ream of safe systems of work and procedures and controls, etc., doesn't necessarily give you effective compliance. You've got to check that and evaluate that, and that can be done in numerous ways. Also includes looking at performance and data and stats and information and all the various things that can link into, occupational health and safety performance generally. So all these things, it's all inclusive, depending on your operations and your requirements of your organisation. As with all management standards, there's a requirement for internal audits. The internal audit program itself, so the program of what you're going to do and when, needs to be documented. And There's also obviously in performance evaluation the management review, which is looking at the management system as a whole. Is it delivering the benefit? Is there things that we need to change? It isn't just an operational review. So it's looking at key elements within the management standard to make sure that the management system remains effectively implemented throughout the organisation. And if there are any issues, how they're going to be addressed, etc. So management review is not just an operational review, it's looking at the management system effectiveness and the review of the actual management system performance in terms of how it delivers and how it is interpreted. Improvement, enhancement of OHS performance is a fundamental objective of the management system, and Section 10 requires this. Incidents and non-conformity information needs to be documented. Continual improvement by enhancing performance, promoting a culture of support, worker participation, improvements, communication, and retaining documented information are fundamental requirements to deliver continual improvement. Section 10.2 is relatively brief in the standard, but it looks at incidents and non-conformity and corrective action, including investigation, who's involved in the investigation, etc. So think of all the other elements. As part of a management system, sections don't work in isolation to other sections. So people need to be involved, workers need to be involved in investigations, they need to be involved in corrective actions. And it needs to be appropriate and effective, and it needs to be reviewed for that effectiveness once you've taken some action, which is also another key area of driving forward continual improvement within the organisation. So, key points to bear in mind. If you're starting from scratch, it may seem obvious, but have access to the standard. Identify sources of legal and statutory compliance, as well as other requirements. Review any existing hazards and risk assessments. Undertake some form of gap analysis can be very useful to identify improvement points within your existing arrangements. Obviously, NQA can provide this service, but you can also do internal reviews yourself. You need to look at your internal audit system and complete a cycle of that, as that will give you some good indications as to where you've got any opportunities for improvement or weaknesses. You need to look at management review, and you need confirmation of assessment dates when looking for registration and certification to the standard. That's done in 2 stages. Stage 1 is a desktop review of your management system to ensure you've got all the component parts, and stage 2 is the actual application of that on site, just make sure it's effectively being delivered. If you're migrating from OHSAS 18,001 to 45,001, there again, it seems really obvious, but have access to the standard. Look at a gap analysis. As I said before, either NQA can provide this service, or you can do an internal review. A mandatory element for any existing registered 18,001 organisation migrating to 45 is you need to do a gap analysis document, which NQA can provide for each client, and that basically confirms that you've looked at the key elements of the management standard. Look at completing the system internal audits, conduct a management review, and when I talk about internal audits, I'm saying internal audits to 45,001 if you're looking to migrate. We don't want to be trying to assess against 18,001 if you're looking at a migration scenario. To ensure all the internal audits are done and complete. Complete a management review and confirm your dates for migration or proposed migration to the revised standard at a time to suit yourselves, really. The other thing to bear in mind is 18,001 will cease to be accepted as from March 2021. So we've just got over 12 months to look at the migration process within your organisations if you've got 18,001. For those who haven't got 18,001, it's a straightforward process, a convenient time for yourself to get stage 1 and stage 2 registration assessments booked in and scheduled, etc. Please, it sounds a long time, 14, 15 months. I can guarantee it'll go very quickly. Don't leave it to last minute. Try and book it in as early as possible to make sure that you're ready, you've got the preparations in place, and there's resources then to support you from an assessment point of view. If everybody waits till the last minute, there can be issues then getting enough assessors to be able to available to come out and do the assessment prior to 18,001 being withdrawn. NQA documents there that are available via the website to help you understand the migration from 18 to 45. I'll just have a quick look at any more questions. The question here, is there any evidence that 45,001 is more costly to operate than 18,001? I would suggest not, certainly from our point of view, although because of the changes to Annex SL, there will be a minimum additional of 1 day for every client migrating from 18,001 to 45, and that's to cover the additional requirements of context of the organisation and leadership. So if your standard recertification for 18 was, let's say, a single day, it will be a minimum of 2 days for the initial migration to 45,001 to cover those additional requirements, because we have to look at things in a little bit more depth. But you can also consider, because 45,001 is using Annex SL as the framework, it can be effectively integrated with other management systems that you may be registered to. So actually, it can reduce cost, because integration can reduce your assessment time and reduce cost and still enhance the performance of your management system overall. So I would suggest it can really be an effective process financially as well as commercially and obviously morally from your protection of workers point of view. Question here about, is it better for a third party to undertake evaluation of compliance audit? Certification bodies do not do evaluation of compliance audits. What we do is sample the effectiveness of your management system to deliver the requirements of the standard. We or any other certification body, certainly UCAS approved certification body, does not undertake evaluation of compliance audits on your behalf. Question here about management review meetings. For management review meetings, can the items for the meeting be split up to be covered in several meetings or meetings throughout the year, or do you have to have it covered in one meeting? No, it's about the effective management. It's about delivering that benefit of what's required within the management review and how that can be delivered within your organisation. So there is some flexibility there in terms of how that's delivered. It can be very difficult sometimes to get everybody in one place at a single point in time. It can be delivered via webinar, and there's all sorts of methods and whatever that management review can be delivered. It's about the effectiveness of that management review that's the key thing. That appears to be all the questions. Hopefully, if you've got any training needs, you'll consider NQA as your provider for those. We deliver training at all different venues, certainly throughout the UK and internationally. We support clients with documentation and information. If anybody needs any specific information regarding training or anything else, by all means email us directly or go onto our website. There's a lot of information on our website. There's a lot of supporting documents on our website. And as I say, just remember that the clock is ticking. 18,001 in sort of 14, 15 months time will be being withdrawn. So all I would suggest is look at where you are, look at what you need to do, and start making the plans and the changes sooner rather than later. You don't want to be leaving it till last minute, as I say, because that can cause problems for both yourselves as clients, and it also can make resourcing our service from our point of view quite difficult. So it's worthwhile to give yourself some rooms to manoeuvre, shall we say, and look at that as soon as possible. And if you're not already registered, then consider 45,001. It's a really good, effective standard. There's a lot of flexibility there, and it can integrate very nicely with your existing 9,001 2015 or 14,001 2015, because they all use that Annex SL framework. So thank you all very much. And if you've got no more questions, thank you for choosing NQA. And as I say, the presentation will be sent out to you. This webinar has been recorded, so you can listen to it at your leisure again, should you need to, or pass it on to your colleagues, etc. But hopefully that's been effective for everybody. Keep well, stay safe. Thank you.